Go, Rob.
Good afternoon. I'm Rob Satloff. I'm the director of the Washington Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special event. The Middle East is one part of the world where the past lives, sometimes easily, sometimes uneasily, with the present, and together they impact the future. This is a week where the past impacts the present. It is the 80th anniversary of a week that I call the most consequential, if forgotten, week in modern Middle East history. It is a week that brings us back to the events in the middle of World War II that have a legacy that still impacts on politics, society, and culture in the Middle East today. A week that begins with Operation Torch, the 80th anniversary of which is today, that moves on to the German invasion of Tunisia later this week, 80 years ago, and then to the conclusion of the Second Battle of El Alamein, which stopped the Germans in the deserts of Western Egypt. What happened, what didn't happen, and how different communities, Arabs, Jews, Muslims writ large, remember what happened. That is the subject of today's discussion. And it is an opportunity, in my view, to step back a moment from the headlines, which occupy so much of our focus on Middle East today, to really get a sense of where this region, how this region developed, what are the big issues that help shape the Middle East that we know today, and how the events of the past still resonate with many communities in and around the Middle East. I'm so delighted that we have a truly remarkable panel, thanks to the wonders of modern technology, from Los Angeles to New York to France to Germany. We have a panel today that represents the finest scholarship on the issues that we are dissecting. Let me very briefly introduce our panel, and then we can go directly into our conversation. Speaking first today will be Professor Omar Boum, a professor of anthropology and the Maurice Amado Chair in Sephardic Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. Omar is the editor with Sarah Abrevaya-Stein of The Holocaust and North Africa, and a number of very important works about the experience of the Holocaust in North Africa. Omar is really a path-breaking historian on this topic. Then we will turn to Martin Kuppers. Martin is professor of history and director of the Ludwigsburg Research Center at the University of Stuttgart. He is co-author with Klaus Michael Malman of Nazi Palestine, the plans for the extermination of the Jews in Palestine, which transformed our historical understanding of what could have been in terms of Nazi aspirations for extending the extermination of the Jewish people throughout the Levant. And I'm delighted that Martin can join us today. Then third, we're going to turn to Professor Chaim Saadoun. Chaim is professor in the Department of History, Philosophy, and Judaic Studies at the Open University in Israel, and director of the Ben Tzvi Institute's Documentation Center of North African Jewry during World War II. Chaim is joining us from Aix-en-Provence, where he is doing research in the French archives on this period. He's an outstanding historian of this period. I'm delighted that he can join us. And then from New York, Professor Mehnaz Afridi. Mehnaz is a professor of religious studies and director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College, where she teaches a course on Muslims and the Holocaust. And so I'm delighted that we have this remarkable array of scholarship to share with our Policy Forum audience today, as we step back a bit from today's headlines to talk about how the past impacts the present, as we look at what happened with the Holocaust's long reach into Arab lands and how it is remembered by Muslim and Jewish communities still today. All right, we'll first turn to Professor Omar Boum. Omar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for inviting me to be in conversation with my colleagues here and to share some of the recent work that I have had the pleasure to collaborate with my colleague Sarah Stein and a number of graduate students here at UCLA. This is what I'm going to talk about is something that relates to this new book that we just got published. It's called Wartime in North Africa, a documentary history, 1934-1950. And what I would like to share with your audience here today is the importance of refocusing on narratives and stories, not only of the pre-war or of the pre-Operation Torch, but narratives that came from regular individuals. So outside of these state bureaucracies and policies, I think we need to refocus on what regular individuals who survived the war, who witnessed the war, who participated in the war, who were affected by the war, and the American landing Operation Torch said about this and how it affected their lives. So I want to start with a story from a person here in LA, a Moroccan Jew who worked with the American army after the landing, and he goes by the name of Sidney Shriki. And so I'm going to read an excerpt from that and then reflect on this excerpt and then move to talk a little bit about how Operation Torch basically had ramifications not only on Jews, but also on Muslims and Senegalese tirailleurs, West Africans, and so on and so forth. And I'll focus here mostly on Morocco, and then I'll end my note with a poem about Tunisia. So Sydney goes, I was an eyewitness to the attack on Casablanca. My building was very close to the harbor, and from our apartment on the 5th floor, we had a bird's eye view of the entire battle. I was about 17 years old, and it was an experience I will never forget. I woke up the morning to the sound of big guns. The Vichy French had declined an early opportunity to surrender to the Americans in British attack from the sea and the air. The ocean was black with a great number of transport ships. From our balcony, it was a spectacular view as we watched Allied planes dive and bomb the Vichy ship that were trying to get out of the harbor. We were so fascinated by what we were watching that it never occurred to us that we could be in danger from a bomb going astray, which did happen in other parts of the city. One French battleship, the Jean Bart, with its 15mm gun, was shooting from the harbor, and the noise was deafening. As the battle was taking place in the harbor, American planes were dropping thousands of leaflets on Casablanca. The leaflets in both French and Arabic contained a message from President Roosevelt that said that the Americans were there to liberate us from German occupation, that they would do us no harm, and they would leave once the threat from Italy and Germany was removed. And I will end here. So what is this? I think from this story, and this story goes for about a few pages, and the idea here is really to rewrite the story of the war and the American landing in particular, and the Allies landing in particular, from the perspective of these individuals. We have so much written about the anti-Jewish laws that were set up by the Vichy government and following the Nuremberg laws, German Nuremberg laws of 1935. We know a lot of how Vichy government set up a lot of labor camps in North Africa, and we know how the pre-war really affected Jews and Muslims and other groups in different ways. But we do not know a lot of what happened to regular individuals after the landing and following the years that come after the landing. And that's why I think as a historian, as an anthropologist, having collaboration between historians and anthropologists, we need to not only gather more stories to tell what happened to the people who were later on freed from the camps throughout that you, Rob, has written about and other people has written about, but also we need to tell about gather stories from communities that survived, or communities that did witness this landing, this Operation Torch. So I think that's the focus of what my research is trying to do in these coming years, is really to refocus on these stories from the North African part. And these are stories not only told from how people witness, but also what's left from the memory perspective. And this leads me to talk about a poem, for instance, what we can learn from popular culture about the war. We do know that there are a lot of stories that have been gathered, but we also know that people express their feelings about the landing, not only in Algeria and Morocco, but also even after the German occupation of Tunisia from 1942 to 1943 for 6 months. We haven't really touched upon what popular history left us, which is our poems, Jewish poems, Muslim poems, poems coming from religious background or non-religious background. So I want to tell a story. I want to read here a poem that was translated again from Tunisian dialect from Arab into English, and it goes by Khamous. Khamous came for us, and Khamous here being the British and soldiers, to some extent also the American soldiers, but mostly talking about the British soldiers. Khamous came from us, comes from the word khamsa, which is 5. Khamous came for us and took out the Germans from our midst. On a Shabbat, we got a shock. Tunis filled up with German soldiers. They spread the army and posted flyers all around, proclaiming, quote unquote, Jews are our enemies. In Tunis, there is a guard. His beard is hard. He stole our money without compassion. They inhabited our houses, looted our assets, ruled over our elders, and took them as hostages. They stole our radios and beds and mattresses, etc., etc. So I think the idea that, what I'm trying to point out here is that this book is full of stories like this. These are stories that try to capture not only the pre-war, but focus on a large part of what happened not only during the from November 8th to November 16th, but also what happened, how America, and I'll finish here with one note about what happened post the landing. Post the landing, you have the beginning of the introduction of American culture. We have the schwung, you have the Coca-Cola, you have all of these commodities that we're not only talking about the freeing and the idea that the landing put an end to the implementation of the anti-Jewish laws, but also the landing, what it did, it really allowed for a new beginning of American capitalism, quote unquote, to be part of North African history. So the idea that Coca-Cola, for instance, an example, I'm working on the introduction of Coca-Cola in the post 1942. You have the beginning of this culture, and that began in Tangier, and then later on became central to Casablanca as a modern and urban city, as a capitalist city, and so on and so forth. So, and then you have also the idea that a lot of Jews, Moroccan and native Jews, were allowed to participate, to have this contact with European Jews. You have an intermarriage that brought a lot of Jews to the United States, became part of the American army. So the landing has really deep implications, not only as far as the end and how the war will end, but without that landing, you won't have D-Day, you won't put an end to the German presence in North Africa, but also it had, as I would say, cultural and economic implications that we'll witness in the 1950s and 60s. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Omar. And just to remind all of our viewers about the historical context, 3 years, May of 1940 to May of 1943, in various parts of North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, Nazi Germany, Vichy France, Fascist Italy controlled part or all of this territory. The landings that Omar was just described, November 1942, marked the beginning of the end of this episode, but it really wasn't over until May of 43, when the Germans were finally expelled from Tunisia. But even then, there was another side of all this, which is what was happening in the Libyan and Egyptian deserts, and the other parts of the Nazi plans. And that's the subject that Martin Kuppers focused on in his very important research. And I'll turn the floor over now to you, Martin.
Well, many thanks for our invitation, and I prepared a little presentation I'd like to share with you. I hope it is visible. And I'd like to present you a special aspect in the context of today's topic based on my own previous research. And I may start with a simple statement. The story around Rommel and his Nazi troops in North Africa, which even in the 21st century is still lauded with many myths and legends, is historically rather little noticed chapter in the history of the Holocaust. The military intervention of Nazi Germany began on Hitler's orders with the landing of the German Afrika Corps under Lieutenant General Erwin Rommel in Libya in February 1941. A few months later, during the decision-making process within the Nazi leadership on the murder of European Jews, Hitler, in the presence of Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, expressed the following comment regarding the Middle East. I may quote, "It is good if we are preceded by the fear that we are exterminating the Jews, the attempt to establish a Jewish state will end in failure." In 1942, the Nazis tried to make exactly that a reality. In the context, it is important to emphasize that the Nazi leadership maintained close relations with Arab collaborators who were even willing to support genocidal policies in the Middle East. The infamous Amin al-Husseini, shown in this photograph together with Himmler, is an important example. I'd like to take you now to the summer of 1942. Rommel launched a new offensive with his German and Italian troops that was able to break through the British front line in Libya. In mid-July, the fortress of Tobruk over there fell, a fact that had hardly been considered militarily possible and was noticed worldwide. For British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, by his own admission, this was the worst moment in the entire World War, the worst moment. Suddenly, the British position in the Middle East seemed most endangered. On a personal map of Rommel's, he marked with expressive lines what was to come next. The occupation of Alexandria in the north and Cairo, and then the advance to the Suez Canal. That's why in Alexandria, the strategically so important port city, the famous Ash Wednesday took place in July 1942. So called because British military personnel began to burn their documents in anticipation of German arrival. For the same reason, Egyptian Jews fled by plane or ship, and individual others even committed suicide. In Jerusalem, strange lion signs appeared on houses of Jewish residents. With these, Arab neighbors were already marking their future property in expectation of the imminent arrival of the German Wehrmacht. And in conversation with me, the mother of a friend of mine living in Tel Aviv remembered that Arab people in the surroundings began to buy flowers during these decisive days to give the Nazi troops a festive welcome. Radio Berlin, the Nazi propaganda station much heard in the Arab world, broadcast a telling appeal on July 7th. I'm quoting again, "Arabs of Syria, Iraq, and Palestine, what are you waiting for?" And further, "This is your best opportunity to get rid of this dirty race which has usurped your rights and brought misfortune and destruction on your countries. Kill the Jews, burn their property, destroy their stores, annihilate these base supporters of British imperialism. Your sole hope of salvation lies in annihilating the Jews before they annihilate you." Well, I think a call for mass murder can hardly be formulated more clearly. In exactly this situation, telling decisions were made in the Berlin center of power. The Holocaust, which had long since begun in Europe, should be exported to the Middle East too. As a result of intensive communication between Hitler, the Wehrmacht leadership, and Himmler's SS, an agreement was worked out to establish and send out a SS murder squad. Rommel was informed subsequently on July 13th. I found this key document in the German Federal Military Archives. It says, quotation again, "With the approval of the Reichsführer SS and Chief of the German Police, the deployment of the SS command to Panzer Army Africa is regulated as follows. First, the task force received its technical instructions from the Chief of Security Police and SD and carries out its task under its own responsibility. It is authorized to take executive measures against the civilian population within the framework of its mission and under its own responsibility." It is important to know that this wording was simply taken over identically from a corresponding agreement of the previous year. There, the rather inconspicuous sentence formed the basis for the use of the SS-Einsatzgruppen in German-occupied Soviet Union. With this very formulation, the SS death squads murdered 500,000 Soviet Jews from June to the end of 1941 alone. That something similar was now being targeted in the Middle East is also made clear by the person of the commander of the established SS unit. SS Obersturmbannführer Walter Rauff was entrusted with this task. The radical SS officer had been responsible under Heydrich in the Reichssecurity Man Office for technical matters and in particular for equipping the SS commands used in the Holocaust in German-occupied European East. Apart from that, Rauff was in charge of the invention and operation of the so-called gas vans. Beginning in the fall of 1941, he had these murder instruments developed and tested, mounted on the chassis of trucks and operating with the carbon monoxide containing exhaust gases of their gasoline engines. Within weeks, Ralph provided proof of the feasibility of his design and subsequently built up to 40 gas lamps. A total of about 400,000 Jews were murdered in these mobile gas chambers in the summer of 1942. This proactive perpetrator then led the SS commando intended for action in the Middle East. I think these spotlights make one thing quite clear. El Alamein was most decisive. This insignificant railroad station in Western Egypt, synonym for a defense line hastily erected by the British Eighth Army and considered by both sides to be only provisional, it is thanks to El Alamein 80 years ago that Rommel and the SS killer Ralph did not reach Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. And so the Holocaust could not be exported to the Middle East. These considerations are counterfactual historiography, but they make clear that if these genocidal Nazi plans had been realized, the arrival of Rommel and Ralph would have threatened the lives of hundreds of thousands of Jews in Egypt, in Palestine, and the entire region. Undoubtedly, this would have had fatal impact on the recent history of the Middle East too, and in particular on the founding of the State of Israel. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's clear that what happened in Europe helped spur the desire to create a safe haven for Jews in what became Israel. And what you have underscored is what happened in El Alamein saved the Jews of then Palestine, who, if the Nazis had come, would not have only killed them, but would have then killed the hope of there being an independent Jewish state in that land. So this is a story of what didn't happen and its enormous consequence for the fate of the Middle East. So thank you very much. So now we're going to turn from some, understanding what did happen and how it affected local communities, both before and after the American landings and the British success, to how it's now remembered by different communities. So I'm going to turn to Professor Chaim Saadun, who I know has been extremely active in addition to his historical research in the process of memory, especially among the Tunisian community. But Chaim, the floor is yours. Chaim, you're on mute still. There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Rob, for your invitation. Thank you for the initiative to prepare this very interesting event, and thanks to my colleagues. It's a very interesting point of view of how the Israeli society in Israel today is remembering this event of the Holocaust. So from my research, what I can say is that the exposure of the Israeli society to the issue of North African during the Holocaust grown over the year, but is most significantly, and I will show it in a minute, in the last 2 decades in Israel. So the analyzing of the situations of the collective memories, remembrance in Israel, and the preservations of the research in Israel is that we can analyze today 5 different periods, or 5 different phases of this phenomena. And it's very interesting to see and to analyze exactly what happened in each period. But I don't think that we will have time to do it, so I will just perhaps make clear about 2 very important points. The first one is that the immigration process of the Jews from North Africa, beginning with 1947 to the end of 1973, just put on the side the stories of the war. Because if from 1944 to as I will show in a minute, from 1944 to 1948 or 1953, with the publications of the novels of Albert Memmi Statue de Sète, Jews in North Africa remember what happened during the war. So it means that after that, with the process of the immigrations of the Jews and with the process of the observations in Israel and in France, just think made different. And the difference is that they talk more about, at the beginning, about Aliyah, that's mean immigration. Then they talked about deportations, sometimes uprooting from those countries, and they didn't saw the period of the war as most important in the whole histories. But if we will begin with the beginning, what just Omar Boom, Professor Boom said about what he wrote about the Renaya Hamus Jana, yes, I have 45 testimonies and evidence, literary evidence, immediately after the war that were written by the Jews. They were written in Tunisia, they were written in Morocco. Some of them are diaries that were not published, some of them diaries that published just after the war. This was something new. As far as I can understand the history of the Jews in the 19th and the 20th century, it was the first time in the history of the community that we have such a big number of literary expressions after such a big event. And moreover then, the leaders of the community, like Paul Guez and Maurice Bourgel, just published their explanations or about what happened during the Nazi period of this time. And we end this period, yes, with the publications of Albert Memmi, La Statue de Sète in 1953. If we see what were the reactions to these publications, it's not the war. It's why you describe our homes, our mothers, as you describe your mother. This was more interesting that is blaming of the Jewish community leader about their behavior during the war. That it means that all the process of immigration that just took the place of the remembrance of the Holocaust and of this period in Tunisia, in Morocco, and in Algeria. So why these people only recently start talking about Holocaust in North Africa, in Israel, and I think it's also in France, in the Jewish community in France. So let's begin with the most important thing is that research on the Holocaust begin from the understanding of what we call the mechanism of murder to the understanding of geographic and thematic periphery, subjects that we are dealing with today. Even the case of North African Jewry during this period were not important at the beginning of the Holocaust research. At the 14th, at the 15th, even during the trial of Eichmann in Israel in 1961, it was not important to talk about what happened in other places. And the second reason is the immigration generations and absorption. It is a common known that people that just immigrate do not deal with cultural questions, with questions of identity, etc. It will take time until they will get and will integrate in the Israeli society or in the French society that they will begin to talk about it. And even we have a very, very late research on the North African community as an all. So we don't even at the beginning, at the 15th, at the 16th, we didn't even know about what really were those communities. It's only beginning with the André Shuraki and Professor Hirschberg and the Michel Abitboul researchers that we know more about it. And even then, we begin to talk about what happened during the war. And there was also the self-perceptions of the Jews, of the North African Jews, because they don't did not see themselves as part of the Holocaust. This was not their story. They did not lose families. They were not witnesses to the horror of the war as it was in Europe. So when in the ceremonies of Yad Vashem each year, when they heard those stories, they said, okay, it's not happened to us. As Martin Kippers just said, it's not happened to us. We were near to this, but not in this. And this is a big difference. And then we had the problem in French archives about the difficulties to obtain archival materials, documents, because of the special attitude of French in regard to the problem of the Vichy regime during Second World War. And I cannot finish this explanation without the exclusions of the Israeli institutions, including Yad Vashem and other at the 15th and the 16th of the story of the Jews, of Oriental Jews in general, North African Jews. And only the questions of the compensations, as I will explain in a minute, make a little change in the situations. And just a minute, sorry. When the law in the Israeli parliament about the compensations to the Jews that were in Libya and Tunisia began, it was at the beginning of 2000s, but the law passed only on 2010, as far as I remember. But the debate on the law was very important. And the debate after the law was passed in the Israeli parliament was even more important, because some of them in the Israeli society began to say, what you are making the comparisons between what happened in Europe and what happened in North Africa. This is not the same story. And the law, it's a political law. It's not really a law that describes the situations in those countries. And the first generations of immigrants from North Africa say, what you are talking about? We are excluded from the story of the Holocaust. We were excluded from all other stories of the big ethos of the Israeli society. The ethos of self-defense, of illegal immigrations, of Holocaust, of course. And now when you are talking about compensations to a Holocaust survivor in Europe, why you are not talking about what happened to the Libyan Jews, to the Tunisian Jews? And at the same time, Jews from Morocco, from Iraq, and even from Yemen say, we are also part of this whole story. The Mufti visited at Yemen. I'm not sure about it, but that's what they said. And they began to invent stories that are not historically right about what happened in North Africa. That was part of the big debate. But what is important is to see the gaps between what we know today in historical facts of the issue and the nature of the arguments of the third generations. They are not really trying to understand what happened. They just want to blame the Israeli society, the Israeli institutions about what happened, about the exclusion of the Jews from this story. And even there is the educational system that neglected the issue at the beginning, but today I think that there is a big change. So where does Israeli society meet today the Holocaust in North Africa? I just give you some examples and I'll show some slides about it. I think that today that the Israeli society deal with this story a lot, really a lot in all the means that I will try to show it. In the social media, there is a lot in the Facebooks and everywhere about what you are talking about, Shoah in North Africa or not, stories that are given by it's an Israeli member of the parliament that is talking about what happened to his grandmother that was new that he's talking about it. And we can see it in the Israeli newspaper. For example, what Erez Biton one of the most known poet in Israel, talked about the life of his parents in North Africa. And it's written every Yom Shoah in Israel, every Shoah Day in Israel, they're talking about the story of the Holocaust in North Africa. And even there is some new, very interesting arts that were done about the story, as something I don't know if it's known, of the painter Raphael Uzan, that describe here in this picture, how the German entered to the little town of Nabel in Tunisia. And today it is in the Museum of Yad Vashem. Very important, and I can make comparisons between what he wrote it and all the poems that you have from this period. And there is also even a comics about the German occupation of not German, also that the Germans were not in Tunisia. As we know, there was only, and as far as I know, only 2 officers that were there, but there is a comics that is very known in Israel. And I will finish with the Israeli parliament and the Israeli court. There was a big debate. To say the truth, I was part of this debate in the Israeli parliament, in the Israeli court, about the questions whether the Jews of Iraq, whether the Jews of Morocco are part of the Holocaust. And it was not only in the court, it was also in the newspapers, in everywhere in Israel, and even in those sessions of the Israeli parliaments about this topic. That means that the Israelis today are remembering, known very much about the story of what happened in North Africa during this period. And I think that there is another angle that should be emphasized. It's the new research about the subjects since the book of Michel Abitboul in 1986. It was published first in French and then in Hebrew. I think that there is today a lot of new research, not enough. I think that there is a very huge possibilities, but it's very interesting to see that this research is not only in Israel, it's as in United States, as Omar Boom showed in Germany, as Martin Cooper said, and we know also in French and in Great Britain. So it's something that the academia in Israel and other countries are very interesting to know what happened in this period in North Africa. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chaim. That's actually fascinating how the memory evolved among the communities and how the larger society accepted and debated where and how this experience plays a role in the overall story of the Holocaust. Thank you very much. And now, Mehnaz, I'm delighted to turn to you to offer a different perspective about how the overall history is remembered by Muslims and Muslim communities. Mehnaz Afridi, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. And wow, we've been hearing from like the stories and narratives post-war, the obstruction of the full destruction of Jews in the Middle East. And then Chaim, I think it's very interesting about how there was this silence and this opening about North Africa that is more recent than ever before. So, I mean, I'm learning so much from my own colleagues here. I don't know if I should say anything, but, I have prepared something about Tunisia specifically in terms of looking at actually maybe the intersections of what perhaps all of you are saying. And the first thing I want to begin with is a quote by Albert Memmi in Pillar of Salt, where he writes, "I'm a Jew. My home is in the ghetto. My legal status is Native African. I come from an Oriental background. I'm poor. But I had learned to reject these four classifications. The Holocaust, as we know, is widely perceived as a tragedy of European Jewry, and 6 million Jews murdered were in fact mainly from Europe. However, the population of approximately 450,000 Jews in the 4 North African countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya suffered, with many who were forced off to forced labor camps before the Germans were expelled from North Africa after the Battle of El Alamein. Now, I'm just saying this for our audience. I may not know really the history of this and what happened. And I'm just going to point out a little bit. So one of the things I love about Memi is how he changes and his identity changes over time in terms of being a Tunisian Jew. He describes the hardships endured in such a camp, the final escape back to Tunisia, his resolve to sign up for the Free French forces fighting the Germans is further complicated by manifestations of anti-Semitism and a demand that he change his Jewish name. So the last few lines from the prologue might serve as a summary of the difficulties of growing up as a poor Jewish child in a Muslim African country ruled as a European colony. He says, perhaps as I now straighten out this narrative, I can manage to see more clearly into my own darkness and to find a way out. One of the things I want us to remember today at the anniversary of the 80th anniversary of liberation in a sense, is that also Muslims were in a different predicament. The predicament was very much like what Albert Memmi describes as being a Muslim, being an Arab, being an African, and also being part of the French government, and also being people who were also intermingled with this culture. This complex history is a long forgotten one. However, my colleagues have shed much light on this historically and in terms of narratives and in terms of the relationship between Muslims and Jews. Why are we doing this today? Why is this important to Muslims and Jews and the relationship between Muslims and Jews? One of the things that I find as an educator and as an intellectual and traveling around the nation is that we know nothing about North Africa. We don't know much about North Africa. We don't have the context of North Africa, which is a very complex place. Tunisia itself had Jews living there 2,000 years ago. Tunisia was Carthage one day. And we forget that Tunisia has such a history and a rich culture that was intermingled. But Tunisia, between 1881 and 1967, was under a lot of different times. Very quick megabytes in terms of history. Anti-Semitism, French colonialism, Arab nationalism, and the creation of Tunisia as a Muslim Arab state converged to create not only the shift of Jewish identity and Jewish condition, but also to bring about a mass exodus of the Jews from the country and their resettlement in France and Israel. Within less than a generation, the Jewish community that had been rooted in Tunisia for more than 2,000 years disappeared. Half of its members went to France, the other half to Israel. These two destinations reflect a Jewish community and identity and two conceptions of Judaism, a nation or a religion. Like in Tunisia, independence and Arab nationalism in places like Algeria and Morocco were accompanied by the liquidation of their respective Jewish communities. The Jews of the Maghreb abandoned their homes, businesses, possessions, became penniless refugees with no thought of return. North Africa's Jewish communities that until the 1960s contained one of the largest Jewish populations in the world disappeared, irrevocably attached to French culture and values, feeling unsafe. In November, and this is historical, 1942, German and Italian troops invaded Tunisia in reaction to the invasion of Algeria and Morocco by the Allies. And that's a very important fact. The Germans soon began initiating anti-Jewish measures. On November 23rd, they arrested 4 Jewish community leaders. So they started rounding up Jews, including its presidents. And on December 6th, the Germans dissolved the Jewish Community Board and ordered the creation of a new one whose first responsibility was to round up 2,000 Jews for forced labor. Eventually, 5,000 Jews were made to do forced labor under harsh conditions in the Italian forced labor camps. The Jews were treated much better after that. So the question becomes that memory and how do we think about it in the Muslim community? In Morocco, for example, we have people who have narratives, who have talked about the war, who have talked about what happened during World War II. We have evidence of that. We have that from excerpts in Algeria, and we have some excerpts in Tunisia. However, the memory of Muslims is a little different from the memory of Jews in terms of the Holocaust. The memory of the Muslims that were living under the Vichy government was about the colonialization of their country, their nation, their culture, their religion, and their rituals. But what's interesting about this, in terms of remembering Tunisia today, is that the memory of both the Jewish and Muslim community differ. As Haim showed how the memory changes from the 1950s onwards about North Africa, it changes also in the Muslim and Arab context. It changes with 1948, but also post-World War II, and then becomes exacerbated by the idea of being Arab versus African, being Muslim versus being Arab. So there's a lot of very interesting ways of thinking about how we should remember this. I, of course, teach about North Africa and the Muslims. We discuss the many Arabs that did indeed participate in what was called colonization, labor camps in places like Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria. And we also talk about the bystanders and the perpetrators in the history of the local Arabs and the Jews under the colonial presence. But what I think is more intriguing, and I know Robert Satloff has done this work, is that many Arabs and Muslims at that time also remember the fact that the Jews were integrated into that culture. They were not seen as other, but as Arabs, as part of, for example, Morocco, especially Algeria and Tunisia. My Muslim students who take my classes become intrigued, engaged, and fascinated by the presence of the Holocaust in Muslim countries. And this is a very important point of convergence, understanding, and most importantly, cooperation. It is not only about the Muslim students that are living here in the United States, but when I travel to places that are not in the United States or Western Europe, I feel that Muslims have something to listen to about North Africa, Arabs, colonialism, and the Holocaust. For example, one of the examples you gave, Haim, were interesting in terms of politicians, the Knesset, but Silvan Shalom's family, who was Prime Minister of Israel, recounts the story of how an Arab Muslim rescued his family. He talks about it, he's interviewed about it. It's actually a political statement, which is very interesting. Then we have other rescuers that have been covered by many people, including Robert Satloff, is Khalid Abdul Wahab, who protected a family and a woman from being attacked. There are many stories that have emerged from looking at North Africa context, and especially Tunisia. The work that I think we have to do in terms of the Muslim and the Arab perspective is to understand our identity through these issues that are challenging today. The work in this area is vital if we want to teach the lessons of the Holocaust to a non-Jewish audience. And I say non-Jewish audience because I think that when you're looking at North Africa, there are a lot of different historical markers that become important in contemporary society today. For example, race relations, for example, Arab and what a Jew is, the racialization of both, for example, how we deal with that today in our contemporary situations. So the intermingling of cultures in historic Tunisia offers us all lots of things to think about, but most importantly, about how we are indeed connected through the experience of the Holocaust, the Shoah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mehnaz. That's fascinating. Very, very interesting. Thank you very much. All right, we have lots of stuff that we could focus on. I want to invite all of our viewers, if you have questions, to enter into this conversation, and I've already received a few. If you could please post them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom bar. You know what I'm referring to, I'm sure, by now. If you could send your question in, and I will get them into this conversation. But let me begin with a couple of questions of my own. Omar, let me start with you. When you look at the countries of North Africa, only one of them today has the same regime that it had then, and that's Morocco. All the other countries have gone through political change, revolution, coups, what have you. How do you think that consistency in Morocco compared to the dramatic political change in other countries has impacted how regimes and even people remember this period?
I don't see any difference between Morocco and Tunisia, for instance, as far as this question of how this issue is remembered. When I say the issue, I'm talking about not only the war, but also the Holocaust itself. Because I think what's important as far as Tunisia and Morocco, and I speak mostly about these two countries, is the willingness from within these institutions, educational institutions, universities in particular, to tackle and to do research about this topic. There is not a huge group of individuals who did study the Holocaust, did study the war, but the fact that there is a small unit willing to study this, I think it allowed, and the fact also that the states itself, Bourguiba, the government of Bourguiba and Hassan II were willing to allow for a conversation with these institutions. I think it was important. Of course, what Morocco is unique in the sense that given the Moroccan Jewish community in Israel, and also the strong link between the monarchy and the Jewish community, and the need for that remembrance to continue and the need for those links to continue, that's what makes also the country also different in some ways from Tunisia. And that's why basically the memory, the involvement of Hassan II in Israeli, Arab, and Palestinian Israelis peace that basically took from Bourguiba, who was central in the 60s, and Hassan II became at the center of this, also allowed for that, for more debate about Jewishness in Morocco, Jewish memory in Morocco, which now you see as far as compared to the rest of the Arab world, it's very, very unique. But it's still, I'm going to go back to the point that Mehnaz mentioned, which still has to do with, yes, there is a political willingness, but how much of that is being basically will carry on to the curriculum, to the textbook? That's, I think, where the conversation, where the fight has to be. So from within Morocco perspective, from within Tunisian perspective, I think we have to figure out a way, and these countries, the ministries of education have to figure out a way how to include this period in the textbook. That's how I think you're willing to build a new generation of scholars who can think about these and who can build on the stories that we're trying to collect. Otherwise, we're going to forget the memories of what happened if we don't really put an emphasis on education, a new generation of scholars and students of the war and of Jewish-Muslim relations that will tackle not only this issue, but the broader issues in general.
And since you mentioned curriculum, I want to ask Chaim about this. I know that some years ago there was a big debate in Israel about, the extent to which this set of stories belongs in the curriculum of learning about the Shoah in Israel. In your view, has this issue been resolved? Is there now an accepted understanding of whether and how memory of what happened in Arab lands is part of what is taught about the Shoah?
I think that absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. I think that there is a better understanding today of the role of the culture and the role of the North African Jewry, their contributions to the Israeli Melpol. It's really a big change in the Israeli curriculum. In most of the high schools in Israel today, you can learn about the subjects. It's not obligatory, but there is, if the teacher wants to do it, there is a special unit that he can make what we call in Israel 5 units in his matriculations, that he can take the story of North African Jewry or the North African Jewry during the Holocaust. At the universities, at the Open University, we have a course with a special unit on Holocaust in North Africa during the Holocaust in North Africa. In most of the universities today, they are teaching the subjects. The Hebrew University, there is a course. I gave courses at the Hebrew University when I taught there. So I think that today the willingness, even of Yad Vashem, to add in each conference that he has on the general subjects, even the point of view of what happened in North Africa. And it was shown in the last international conferences that Yad Vashem organized about the subjects of camps, about the subjects of the Yellow Badge. Always it took also the story of North Africa. So that means that even Yad Vashem, the universities, the institutions like ghetto fighters in the north of Israel, they're all willing to do with these subjects. I am very concerned about the Israeli Arabs and their attitude toward the subjects. And I wish to see them more and more participating in this story. There is a famous book of Amos and Omar Bashir, Bashir and Amos Goldberg about the Nakba and the Holocaust. It's a very important book. So we are telling about story of suffering and what to do with those suffering and how to tell those suffering. Also, today in Israel, it's a little difficult to talk about the Nakba and the Holocaust, you know, at the same phrase, it's at the same sentence, it's a little difficult. But if I may, 1 minute more, I want to add a little understanding that I have from what I learned about what happened in Tunisia and the collective memory of the Jews of Tunisia. When we saw the testimonies of the Jews from Tunisia, oral testimonies and written testimonies, they are talking more about the bombardment in Tunisia than the suffering from the German. And it's very interesting because the bombardment was from the Allied, not from the German. And from my parents, for example, yes, and my grandfathers, yes, went to an Arab villages and they lived there about 4 months during this period. And they remember it very well. That means there was a special coexistence, very interesting, between Jews and Muslims during this period because of this bombardment of Tunisia. And this is something that we have to take together and to talk when we want to see, when we want to talk, when we want to understand more about the Holocaust denial in the Arab world. I think it's very important to see what happened in North Africa and to say, look, we have other examples, yes, of Holocaust.
Okay, thank you. Martin, somebody, questions that have come in. One question specifically regarding El Alamein and the role of the Jewish Brigade in El Alamein. Could you explain a little bit who that was? Was it significant? And what role it played in the battle?
Well, the famous Jewish Brigade built up in Palestine under the British, and I'm not sure. I'm not that deep in the history of the Jewish Brigade. As far as I know, they began to build the brigade in the early 1940s. And I guess the first task of the Jewish Brigade have been in Europe. So the second, so some task, some fighting of the Jewish Brigade during El Alamein, I'm not sure about it. I doubt it a little bit, but in other cases, this Jewish Brigade has been very famous for their fighting in Italy after the landing of the European continent.
And another question that is posed specifically about your own research, can you explain the role of Rommel? Rommel himself at one time was viewed as sort of the clean general, the purely military focused leader. More recently, information has come forward that makes him more complicit in the anti-Jewish effort in Libya. What's your assessment of Rommel?
Rommel, yeah, we have to deal with that giant myth of a German general being so positive for Nazi propaganda. He was in the early 1940s. He was one of the most legendary persons in German Nazi propaganda, and he was very willing to work for Goebbels and for Nazi propaganda. That goes without saying. And I guess the fact is very simple. Rommel has had the luck to be fortunate to lose the battle at El Alamein. If not, he would have been one of the many German generals being deeply involved in Nazi annihilation policies. And because he lost the battle at El Alamein 80 years ago, he was a person around myth and legends developed. And I found in the archives, in German archives, a few documents proving that even Rommel too realized anti-Jewish policies in Libya. So German soldiers aren't allowed to buy in Jewish shops, and so it's very simple. Rommel is no exception, not at all, and only the war campaign in North Africa built up this legend. Even present in 21st century.
Okay,
but I tried to explain that Rommel was deeply involved in the campaign regarding Egypt and Palestine, and he would have been exception in the case that Walter Rauff, this SS officer, joined Panzerarmee Africa and did organize anti-Jewish mass crimes and massacres in Egypt and in Palestine too.
Okay, thank you. And Mehnaz, let me ask you a different question. From the historical research I did during this period, the early 1940s, the Muslim religious hierarchy were among the most supportive and protective of the local Jewish communities, imams, local religious figures, which is a fascinating phenomenon when one thinks about, at least in the more current contemporary world, one thinks about it differently. How do you explain, or when did this shift take place, and how should one think about the role of like Muslim religious leadership and its understanding of this history?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, and you're right. I mean, the Muslim leadership in a lot of these places were very much about, securing Jews and not inciting hatred towards them internally, right? We're talking about the Arab Muslim community. I think it hasn't changed. I know that sounds weird, but there are some pockets of real responsible imams that would say the same thing today. The thing that has changed is the extremism and the way that Jews are perceived by some extremist religious groups in the Muslim world. So, for example, I'm from Pakistan, and so there are many imams that will say, you know, we have to be peaceful with the other. And there are as many that will say, well, you know, Jews are our enemy. So there's a difference. I can't really whitewash it in terms of that. Like, for example, in Tunisia, if you look at their curriculum in the last, I'd say about 18 to 20 years, they have very inclusive language about peace with the other. That was included in their textbook, and that's in the last 20 years, right? And then they have also the inclusion of mentioning the Holocaust. So, and I'm interested in how that kind of message is going through in Islamic communities. So one of the things is that the way that I understand Islam, and I am Muslim, is that we are to protect Jews and Christians and others from harm. There is no coerciveness in religion. However, the political situation, and I think that, you know, Martin touched on this in terms of the propaganda in the Arab world, made a very big difference in terms of those that were bystanders or perpetrators at that time. And then further on today, you have a whole issue, and that's why I keep coming back to this colonial issue, that we must educate people about what colonization was and how severe it was, not a comparison with what happened in the labor camps, not at all a comparison with the Holocaust, and I've written about this, but we must understand what colonization did to a lot of the Arab and Muslim populations. And I think we're still in that historical cycle in terms of who has power in terms of a religious community and how do we use that religious community. So I would say that, yes, that you're right, that if you look at it in terms of historical perspective, that the Muslim clerics or the Muslim institutions or the religions did protect Jews. And I think now you have a difference and a change in terms of that, because you also have nation state building of the many countries that were under, say, like, you know, the King of Morocco. I mean, where is the King of Morocco today? What's the role of that? There's a really very different kind of hierarchy that's going on in these places. So it's interesting to look at both the colonial impact on these countries, where the power lies, and where the extremism comes from in terms of anti-Semitism and what we have to deal with today in terms of the Muslim world.
Okay, thank you. We only have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted just to ask you all very briefly, what is the next phase of historical research, the big questions that we still need to answer? I know, Omar, you hinted at this earlier about how the landings affected local communities in a whole social cultural way. But I'd like to just get from you, so our viewers can leave with what they might expect to see over the next few years. What are the big historical, cultural, even political questions that occupy you and that deserve to be answered? So we'll go back to the way we started. Omar, why don't you start?
So for me, there are two things. The first point is, how do we interact as scholars of the Holocaust with younger generation? So, and that's, so one of the things is how we turn the material we write into a material that's accessible to the general population. That's why I did this book. Sarah Stein and I worked on this book on the documentary history, because it really rendered legible and accessible the information to the general audience. And then I am into, I have a graphic novel coming out with Stanford University Press, where is basically trying to let the images speak to students and the general audience. So that's one thing. The second point is working on questions that are still not answered and where we still have a lot of debate about, which is, and something that's, I think Mehnaz mentioned, so how do we tell stories that are still controversial, and how do we, which is the story, for instance, of Muhammad V, Sultan Sidi Muhammad bin Yusuf, whether he saved Jews or not. This is a question that's still debated within Jewish circles, Moroccan Jewish circles, and Europe and with Yad Vashem and the Holocaust Memorial Museum. These are the big questions that are part of, that are still, so that's a project that I am really working with on with Daniel Schroeter now. We hope to get it done in the next year or so. So this is what drives me. And then with all of these things is how we take these stories and these questions that are really at the center of what we do, and then make sure that we train a new generation of Holocaust scholars that are looking at this question from different angles. It's not only the Israeli School of Historiography or the American School of Historiography. We have other nations that are involved, on both sides of the Mediterranean, and probably even in places in Asia, in India, in Japan, in China. So we need to expand those, because this was a part of world global history. And that's the challenge, I think.
Okay, thank you. Martin, what's the next challenge for the historian on this?
Well, I'm really deeply impressed of the contributions you all made, and I think all of you mentioned in one way or another to collect memories, and I think this is one of the key aspects for the future too, to collect, as historians as we are, memories on that period, documents, or even still in oral history. So to collect sources, we all are well aware time is running short. And Mehnaz mentioned interesting aspect, the change of memories, and I think that's one point we should be part of, to try to teach our students, to try to teach future teachers that some part of the history we are researching and we are working on might be changed by the memory of the societies, and that's could be most fascinating.
Okay, thank you. Chaim, what's next?
First, I just want to say that I fully agree with Omar Boom's perceptions about what we should do at the next steps, but I would like to add something else. I think that we have to see first the complexity of the situations in North Africa in regard to the Muslims and the European society at that time. This is not only the story or the history of the Jews in North Africa during this period. It's a whole history of those old communities, and we have to see, and I think that today there is a lot of new documents that can help us to understand it, yes, to see this complexity in the relationships between those three communities, main communities in North Africa, mainly Algeria, that we didn't talk about it today, that it's very important, but Tunisia and Morocco also. And then to go to the small communities in North Africa. I'm now working in Aix-en-Provence in Les Archives d'Outre-mer on the communities of the Sahara during this period, and there is new material. So we know the story, we know the big process of the Second World War in North Africa, but we don't know what exactly happened in each community. And I think that we have to open it more widely than it was before. It's not only the processes that resemblance to what happened in Europe, it's only to see it in the context of the North Africans. And as you saw, I am very, very interested in how the Israeli society preserved the collective memory of the history of North Africa, but mainly of this period. And there is a lot of new expressions in the Israeli society today that are very, very interesting.
Okay, thank you, Chaim. And Mehnaz, what's next?
Wow, I have a lot. So I really, I am been working very hard to expand the Holocaust, which means that I want it to be expand it to different geographies. I mean, of course, North Africa is part of it. But, you know, my colleague and I, Mark Solansek, just put together a book, which Omar has submitted an article to, called The International Approaches to the Holocaust. So it's a book that does not mention Europe at all. And we talk about Asia and Africa, places like Mauritania, that were, you know, important in terms of either Jewish immigration or the status of Holocaust education. That's my first thing that I think we have to keep expanding, because my goal is to talk to non-Jewish audiences. My other goal is to look at educational curriculum, even here in this country, where I've built Holocaust curriculum for Muslim schools here in Brooklyn and New York City, where I'm teaching about North Africa, but also, you know, looking at the history of the Holocaust, and so they can make those connections. I think those are really important to do as actually Muslim educators in Muslim schools, and to educate the future generation of Muslim scholars to get interested and invested in this material. And then the third thing I really am interested in doing in terms of specifically North Africa is I'm working on a book called The Wounded Muslim, about memory and tragedy. And that's a monograph where I'm looking at the pain, and this goes to Robert's question in terms of religion, is the pain and the loss of a certain kind of religiosity post-colonialism. And I'm interviewing people that are going through either genocide and war, and there are reflections on that, and trying to gauge what people were thinking about the loss of religion especially, and how did they heal themselves in terms of their woundedness of identity. I mean, very much informed by post-Holocaust theology in some ways, but also a very interesting question that people have not asked about the Muslim and Arab world. What about the wounding and the loss of the Muslims and the Arabs, and the pain and the suffering? And how do we engage that by being Muslims and Islamic? And does that help, or does that, you know, encourage something in us? So that's the future. And I think that would be helpful for non-Muslim readers to understand sort of the history of the suffering of the Arab and Muslim people. I think that's a lot of questions.
Thank you very much, Mehnaz. I can only add, I spent a lot of time, last year I did the first Holocaust remembrance events in Abu Dhabi and Cairo. Hopefully this year we'll do the first one in Saudi Arabia. I've done events, you know, in countries from North Africa through the Gulf. There is an enormous thirst for knowledge. People want to know. They want to know. I was in Egypt last year. They wanted to know more about how the Egyptian people either feared, prepared, or were excited about the coming of the Nazis. They wanted to know more details about their own story, which I thought was, you know, a wonderfully healthy desire. And so there are audiences out there that are just waiting for everything that all four of you are doing, and that are waiting for other historians to fill this void. So with that, I want to thank you all very much. I know we only scratched the surface of this large topic, but that's all you can do on Zoom these days. And so I'm grateful very much that you could join us. And thank you for contributing your thoughts and ideas to this historically relevant and still timely policy forum, 80 years after the critical events in North Africa that helped shape where the Middle East is today. Thank you all very much for joining us at this Washington Institute event. Bye-bye.